In Ohio, death row is crowded with men whose crimes shocked an entire state. In 2025, the clock began ticking for some of the most notorious killers. A man who wiped out children in a single night, another who gunned down a police officer in broad daylight, and others whose names still haunt courtrooms and headlines. Their dates were set, their executions were scheduled. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe for more true crime breakdowns, updates on death row cases, and execution timelines across the United States. Douglas Kohley. The crime that placed Douglas W. Kohley on Ohio's death row occurred in 1997 and left the city of Toledo shaken. Kohley was convicted of the kidnapping and murder of 21-year-old Brandy Stevens, along with the brutal assault of another woman during the same period. According to prosecutors, Kohley targeted young women with alarming violence. Brandy Stevens, a college-aged woman described as hardworking and full of promise, disappeared after being lured into his company. Her body was later discovered, and investigators determined she had been kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered in a crime that was both calculated and sadistic. What set Kohley's case apart was the forensic evidence. At the time, DNA testing was becoming a decisive factor in criminal trials, and in this case, the results were overwhelming. Biological samples collected from the crime scene and victim were matched directly to Kohley, leaving little room for doubt. Prosecutors built their case around this DNA evidence, along with witness testimony, to demonstrate Kohley's direct involvement. The jury heard not only about the murder of Brandy Stevens, but also about Kohley's involvement in another violent assault on a different young woman, which painted a broader picture of him as a predator. This combination of crimes, one fatal and the other a near-fatal attack, convinced jurors that he was too dangerous to ever walk free again. The trial concluded with a conviction on charges of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and assault, and in 1998, Kohley was sentenced to death. For the family of Brandy Stevens, the verdict was seen as justice for a crime that had devastated their lives, though the pain of her loss never faded. Ohio's designated execution procedure was lethal injection, which became the standard method for carrying out death sentences in the state. Kohley, like other death row inmates, was assigned this method. Douglas Kohley's execution is scheduled for September 24, 2025. Kohley's case stands as one of Ohio's most clear-cut death penalty convictions of the late 1990s, a crime where DNA evidence sealed his fate. For many, his name is remembered not just for the brutality of the murder, but as part of Ohio's broader struggle over the death penalty and its future. Timothy L. Coleman. The case of Timothy L. Coleman dates back to 1996 in Dayton, Ohio, and centers on the murder of 21-year-old Melinda Stevens. According to prosecutors, the killing occurred during a robbery that turned violent, but the evidence presented in court suggested far more than a spontaneous act. It was argued to be premeditated and coldly executed. Melinda Stevens was described as a young woman with a promising future, well-liked in her community, whose life was cut short in a senseless act of violence. On the night of the crime, Coleman reportedly confronted her during a robbery attempt. Prosecutors alleged that Coleman planned the encounter and deliberately armed himself, ensuring he had the means to carry out violence if necessary. The confrontation escalated quickly. Evidence showed that Coleman attacked Stevens with lethal intent, killing her in what the state labeled a calculated murder committed in the course of theft. Witness testimony, forensic evidence, and circumstantial details tied Coleman to the scene, convincing the jury that this was not an accidental killing, but a deliberate act of control and aggression. The brutality of the crime, and the fact that it targeted a young, unarmed woman, left a lasting scar on the Dayton community. Family members described Melinda as full of life, with plans and dreams that were stolen in a single night. At trial, the prosecution emphasized Coleman's history of violence and argued that the murder demonstrated a willingness to kill without hesitation. The jury found him guilty of aggravated murder and aggravated robbery, and in 1997, Timothy Coleman was sentenced to death. As with other death row inmates in Ohio, Coleman was assigned lethal injection as the method of execution. It remains the state's only authorized method, despite ongoing controversies about the availability of the required drugs. Timothy Coleman's execution is scheduled for October 30th, 2025. For many, his conviction represents justice for the life of Melinda Stevens, even as the decades-long wait for an execution has left the victim's family in limbo. Percy Hutton. The case against Percy Hutton stems from the 1985 murder of Derek Mitchell in Cleveland, Ohio. Prosecutors argued that Hutton orchestrated the killing as part of a robbery scheme targeting Mitchell, a man he knew, in what was described as a cold and calculated attack. According to trial records, Mitchell was lured under the pretense of a friendly visit. Once inside, the situation turned violent. Prosecutors claimed Hutton confronted Mitchell with a firearm, demanding money. The robbery quickly escalated, and Mitchell was shot at close range, leaving him fatally wounded. Witnesses later recounted hearing a gunshot and finding Mitchell's body, sparking one of Cleveland's most high-profile murder investigations of the mid-1980s. The state's case emphasized that this was not a crime of passion, but rather a premeditated act. Prosecutors said Hutton deliberately planned the robbery, targeted a vulnerable victim, and executed Mitchell with no hesitation once he resisted. What made the case even more striking was the pattern of evidence the state presented. A handgun allegedly tied to Hutton was entered into trial, and testimony from associates painted him as a man capable of violence. Jurors were told that Hutton carried out the killing for financial gain, portraying him as someone who valued money over human life. But Hutton's defense told a very different story. He has always insisted he is innocent of the murder, and that his trial was riddled with errors. His lawyers argued that key forensic evidence was weak, that eyewitness accounts were unreliable, and that the jury was improperly influenced by racial bias. Later appeals raised questions of ineffective legal counsel, suggesting his defense at trial failed to present a full case in his favor. Despite these claims, the jury convicted him of aggravated murder with the specification of committing the crime during a robbery, making him eligible for the death penalty. In 1986, Percy Hutton was formally sentenced to die. Ohio law mandates lethal injection as the method of execution. Hutton, like other condemned prisoners in the state, was assigned this method, though Ohio has faced repeated problems securing the required drugs. His execution was originally scheduled for June 18, 2025, but later reprieved and rescheduled to June 21, 2028. Until then, Hutton remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. Samuel Morland. The murders committed by Samuel Howard Morland remain among the most horrifying mass killings in Ohio's modern history. On August 31, 1985, in Columbus, Morland brutally murdered 5 people in a single night, including 4 children. According to court records, the killings unfolded inside the home of his girlfriend, Diane Miller. Morland entered the residence during the early morning hours after a heated argument. Inside were Miller, her 4 young children, and another adult guest. Armed with a firearm, Morland unleashed a mass execution-style attack. Prosecutors described how Morland shot and killed Diane Miller before turning the gun on her children, ages ranging from toddlers to preteens. Each child was murdered in cold blood, with investigators later saying the crime scene was one of the most devastating they had ever encountered. The final victim, an adult friend of the family, was also executed in the rampage. The brutality and scale of the crime shocked Columbus to its core. Neighbors and community leaders called it a slaughter, and newspapers at the time compared the killings to war-zone violence. Detectives testified that the crime scene was so graphic that even seasoned officers struggled to contain their emotions. Morland was arrested shortly afterward. At trial, the state presented overwhelming evidence, including eyewitness accounts and forensic findings, linking him directly to the murders. The prosecution argued that the killings were deliberate and merciless, carried out as an act of rage and control. The jury convicted Morland of multiple counts of aggravated murder, and due to the sheer number of victims and their ages, the death penalty was considered unavoidable. In 1986, he was formally sentenced to death, and his case quickly became symbolic of Ohio's stance on punishing the most heinous crimes with execution. Ohio law prescribed lethal injection as the method for carrying out Morland's sentence. Like others on death row, he was assigned this method, though the state has since faced ongoing challenges in acquiring the necessary drugs. Samuel Morland was originally scheduled to be executed on July 30th, 2025. However, his execution has been rescheduled to July 19th, 2028, after the state pushed all death sentences forward due to ongoing difficulties with lethal injection protocols. Morland's case remains one of the most notorious in Ohio death penalty history. The murder of 4 children alongside 2 adults placed him among the most reviled inmates on death row, and his name still stirs anger and sorrow in Columbus nearly 4 decades later. Kareem M. Jackson. In 1997, a robbery in Franklin County turned into a double homicide that prosecutors described as execution-style killings. The man at the center of it was Kareem M. Jackson, later convicted of murdering 2 men during what was initially planned as a drug-related robbery. According to trial testimony, Jackson, along with accomplices, targeted a group of men believed to have money from drug activity. The robbery unfolded in a cold and deliberate fashion. Witnesses and survivors described how Jackson and the others forced the victims to the ground, taking control of the situation with guns drawn. 2 men were then shot at close range in the head, a method prosecutors said mirrored an execution, designed to ensure no witnesses were left alive. The killings were not only brutal, but also calculated, demonstrating, in the jury's view, that Jackson and his partners had gone far beyond the scope of a robbery gone wrong. The victims' deaths devastated families and rattled the Franklin County community, highlighting the intersection of violent crime and drug-related activity that plagued the area in the 1990s. Prosecutors emphasized that Jackson played a leading role in the murders, and forensic evidence, along with witness testimony, cemented his guilt. At trial, the jury deliberated on whether the crime merited the death penalty. The manner of the killings, 2 men executed on the ground, defenseless, left little room for mercy. Jackson was convicted of aggravated murder and aggravated robbery, and in 1998 he was sentenced to death. Like other inmates on Ohio's death row, Jackson's sentence is to be carried out by lethal injection, the state's sole authorized method of execution. Kareem Jackson was originally scheduled for execution on December 10, 2025. With Governor Mike DeWine's reprieves, his date has been rescheduled to October 11, 2028, and he remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. Jackson's case stands as one of Ohio's most chilling examples of a robbery turned into deliberate execution-style killings. The calculated nature of the crime was the decisive factor in the jury's decision to impose the death penalty. Quacy Bryan. The name Quacy Bryan is forever tied to one of Cleveland's most infamous and heartbreaking crimes, the 2000 murder of Officer Wayne Leon, a 32-year-old Cleveland police officer. On the morning of June 25, 2000, Officer Leon conducted what appeared to be a routine traffic stop outside a convenience store. Bryan, who was wanted on outstanding warrants, was behind the wheel of the stopped vehicle. As Leon approached, witnesses said Bryan pulled a gun, shooting the officer in the face at point-blank range before fleeing the scene. The murder stunned the city. Leon was not only a dedicated police officer, but also a husband and father of 3 young children. His killing, carried out in broad daylight, became headline news across Ohio. Thousands of mourners, including officers from across the state, attended Leon's funeral, making it one of the largest police funerals in Cleveland's history. Bryan was captured shortly after the shooting and charged with aggravated murder of a police officer, a capital crime under Ohio law. At trial, prosecutors described the killing as a deliberate ambush designed to avoid arrest. Witnesses testified about the suddenness of the attack, and ballistic evidence confirmed Bryan fired the fatal shot. The defense attempted to argue issues of mental health and the stress Bryan faced while evading law enforcement, but the jury was unmoved. They concluded that Bryan knowingly executed a uniformed police officer in front of bystanders. In 2001, Bryan was sentenced to death. The case continued to draw public attention through years of appeals. For police officers and their families across Ohio, the murder of Officer Leon symbolized the dangers they face daily, and many saw Bryan's death sentence as a necessary measure of justice. Ohio law mandates lethal injection as the method of execution, the same procedure assigned to all death row inmates in the state. Quacy Bryan's execution was originally scheduled for November 2026. However, with statewide reprieves issued by Governor Mike DeWine, his date has been rescheduled to November 15, 2028. He remains incarcerated at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. Bryan's case is one of the most high-profile death penalty cases in Ohio in recent decades. The cold-blooded murder of Officer Wayne Leon, a young husband, father, and public servant, left a lasting scar on Cleveland and ensured Bryan's place among the state's most notorious death row inmates. 6 names, 6 crimes that shook Ohio to its core. Each man has waited decades on death row, their sentences delayed but never erased. Behind prison walls, they live each day knowing that the state still intends to carry out the ultimate punishment, death by lethal injection. For Percy Hutton, Samuel Morland, Douglas Kohley, Timothy Coleman, Kareem Jackson, and Quacy Bryan, time has become both their shield and their torment. Their victims' families have waited for justice. The prisoners themselves have waited for the state to act. And as new execution dates loom on the calendar, Ohio's death row remains filled with men who know their names are written in ink, just waiting for the day that ink is finally turned into action.